Imagine standing at the bottom of the world, not on the continent we know today, a desert of compressed ice and scoured rock, but on a surface layered with deep soil, saturated with moisture, covered in dense canopy. The year is approximately 90 million years ago. The continent now called Antarctica sits closer to the South Pole than any landmass on Earth, yet its surface temperature averages somewhere between 12 and 13 degrees Celsius. Rainfall exceeds 1,000 millimeters annually. The soil is dark, organic, and alive. What exists here is not a frozen frontier. It is a functioning rainforest ecosystem operating at the edge of a polar world. And it has been in place for millions of years already. This was not an accident of geography. It was the result of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations estimated at 2 to 4 times their pre-industrial levels, a greenhouse state that distributed warmth toward the poles far more efficiently than modern climate systems allow. Evidence recovered from sediment cores drilled through the Ross Sea floor in 2020 reveals fossilized root networks, pollen grains, and spore fragments consistent with a dense, temperate to subtropical forest environment. These materials were preserved in layers approximately 90 million years old, deposited during what geologists classify as the mid-Cretaceous period. The data indicates that vegetation existed within 900 kilometers of the South Pole itself. At Antarctic latitudes, even in a warmer world, the sun still disappeared below the horizon for extended periods. Evidence suggests that the forests near the pole experienced between 2 and 4 months of continuous darkness each year. The trees that thrived here were not those adapted to constant sunlight. They were adapted to interruption. Beneath the canopy, the understory filled in with ferns, bars, horsetails, and plants that had only recently begun their evolutionary expansion across the planet. The Cretaceous was the period during which angiosperms, flowering plants, were diversifying rapidly, moving into ecological niches previously held entirely by ferns and gymnosperms. In the Antarctic forests, this transition was underway. Pollen records show a complex layering, ancient spore-bearing plants occupying the shadowed ground level, while newer flowering species competed for light in the mid-canopy. The forest floor itself was wet, covered in decaying organic matter, and crisscrossed by shallow root systems, spreading laterally through soil that was unlikely to freeze deeply, if at all, during the warmest intervals of this period. Water moved through this landscape in volume. Current reconstructions of mid-Cretaceous Antarctic hydrology suggest a network of broad, slow-moving rivers draining from elevated interior regions toward the coastline. These rivers carried sediment, nutrients, and organic material across a continent whose surface relief was significantly different from what lies buried beneath modern ice. Drainage patterns visible in ancient rock formations exposed in the Transantarctic Mountains and the Antarctic Peninsula indicate that this was a well-watered, topographically complex landmass. Wetlands and floodplains extended across low-lying basins. Fog formed regularly along river valleys and coastal zones, driven by the interaction between warm, humid air and the cooler air masses that built during autumn. To understand what that forest actually was, it helps to understand the conditions that shaped it. Antarctica, in the mid-Cretaceous, was still connected to other landmasses along the edges of what had once been the supercontinent Gondwana. South America and Antarctica shared a continuous land bridge. Warm ocean currents circulated freely along the continent's coasts without the interruption of the circumpolar current that defines Antarctica's modern isolation. Heat transferred northward from equatorial regions flowed more readily toward the south, and the absence of a large polar ice sheet meant that the albedo effect, called the reflective ice and snow, was not operating at anything close to modern intensity. Before we go further, take a moment to consider where you're watching from, which country, and how impossible it would seem to stand in an Antarctica covered not in ice, but dense forests alive with predators, insects, and heavy prehistoric heat. If these lost worlds keep drawing you in, consider subscribing to continue the journey. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Lower the lights, let the modern world drift away. And imagine warm rain falling through thick canopies as unfamiliar calls echo across a dangerous jungle at the edge of the ancient world. The forests that developed under these conditions were not tropical in the strict sense. Paleopalynological analysis, the study of ancient pollen and spores extracted from rock and sediment, reveals a canopy dominated by coniferous trees, relatives of modern swamp cypress, Podocarpus and Araucaria. These were slow-growing, highly adaptable species capable of surviving the one condition that no amount of warmth could eliminate: the polar winter. The atmosphere itself carried more moisture than it does today. Higher CO2 concentrations accelerated evaporation and intensified the hydrological cycle. Rain fell more frequently and more heavily. Sediment records show thick sequences of fine-grained deposits, consistent with sustained, regular rainfall rather than episodic storms. This moisture, cycling continuously through soil, vegetation, and atmosphere, sustained canopy densities that would have made the forest interior dim even during summer months when the sun circled low on the horizon for weeks at a time, never fully setting. This perpetual low-angle light during summer created a photosynthetic environment unlike anything in the modern temperate or tropical world. The sun did not rise and set in a predictable daily rhythm. It spiraled slowly across the sky, casting long shadows across a forest adapted to lateral, diffuse illumination. Plants here evolved photosynthetic machinery capable of operating under these unusual light conditions. Fossil leaf structures recovered from Antarctic Cretaceous deposits show anatomical features, including large, densely packed chloroplast arrays, consistent with adaptations to low-intensity, continuous light. These were not the symplants that grew at lower latitudes. They were a distinct polar ecotype, shaped over millions of years by conditions unique to the high south. The scale of what existed here is difficult to compress into simple terms. The Antarctic continent covers approximately 14 million square kilometers. During the mid-Cretaceous, a significant portion of that area, particularly the western regions and the peninsula, extending towards South America, was covered in continuous dense forest. Conservative estimates based on sediment distribution and pollen dispersal patterns suggest that forested zones extended across, at minimum, several million square kilometers of the continent's surface. This was not a marginal or fragile ecosystem clinging to a coastal fringe. It was a continental-scale biome generating its own weather, cycling enormous volumes of carbon, and supporting a full ecological hierarchy from soil organisms to large vertebrates. Below the surface, the soil biome operated in complex cycles. Decomposition proceeded more slowly than in equatorial forests due to the lower average temperatures, but it proceeded. Fungi networks spread through the organic matter on the forest floor. Invertebrates processed leaf litter and woody debris. The chemical signals of this biological activity are preserved in the geochemical signatures of ancient soil layers, or paleosols, recovered from exposed Antarctic rock sequences. Elevated concentrations of organic carbon and specific isotopic ratios in these layers point clearly to prolonged biological activity. Not a brief, warm interval, but a stable functioning ecosystem operating across timescales measured in millions of years. This stability matters. Ecosystems do not simply appear, they accumulate. The Antarctic forest of the mid-Cretaceous was not a recent development by geological standards. It had been building, adjusting, and deepening its complexity for tens of millions of years before the period from which most fossil evidence has been recovered. The species present in 90-million-year-old Antarctic sediments were already the products of long evolutionary processes on this continent. Their presence implies predecessors, earlier forest communities, older soil networks, and deeper ecological histories now largely inaccessible beneath kilometers of ice and rock. What the sediment record does preserve is enough to establish the essential character of this lost world. It was dense, wet, and dark in winter. It was complex, layered, and biologically rich across all seasons. It operated under atmospheric and climatic conditions radically different from the present, and it sustained those conditions through its own biological processes, absorbing carbon, cycling water, moderating temperature at local and regional scales. The forest was not simply growing on Antarctica. In a measurable sense, it was part of what kept Antarctica warm enough to support a forest at all. That relationship between living systems and the physical environment that sustains them is one of the clearest messages embedded in the rock beneath the southern ice. The continent did not passively receive its climate. It participated in it, and when the conditions that supported the forest began, slowly, to change, the forest itself began to alter the feedback loops that had kept it alive. What had been self-reinforcing stability would eventually become self-reinforcing collapse. But in the deep middle of the Cretaceous, that process had not yet begun. The rivers still moved, the canopy still closed overhead, the soil was still alive, the continent at the bottom of the Earth was green. By the mid-Cretaceous, dinosaurs had been the dominant large vertebrates on Earth for more than 100 million years. They occupied every major landmass, adapted to deserts, coastlines, floodplains, and mountain forests. But the population that established itself in the high southern latitudes represented something distinct. A lineage shaped not primarily by heat or aridity, but by darkness. The polar dinosaurs of Antarctica were not visitors. Bone histology, the microscopic examination of growth rings preserved within fossil bone tissue, indicates that at least some species residing in high-latitude Cretaceous environments were year-round inhabitants. Growth ring patterns in recovered specimens show continuous skeletal development through what would have been winter months, a pattern inconsistent with long-distance seasonal migration. These animals lived through the polar night. They did not leave. Understanding what that meant requires a precise picture of the seasonal cycle they endured. At latitudes between 70 and 80 degrees south, the Cretaceous polar winter produced between 2 and 4 months of complete or near-complete darkness. Temperatures during this period likely dropped significantly below the annual average, though current models suggest they remained above freezing in many lowland and coastal zones due to the elevated atmospheric CO2 concentrations sustaining the broader greenhouse climate. Snow may have fallen. Ice likely formed along slower river margins and in shallow wetland pools. The forest did not die, but it slowed. Canopy photosynthesis ceased. Insect activity decreased sharply. The food web contracted to whatever could persist on stored energy, cached resources, or the limited biological activity that continued in the dark. Dinosaurs navigating this environment faced a constraint that their lower latitude relatives did not. Energy availability collapsed on a seasonal schedule that was absolute and predictable. Whatever physiological and behavioral strategies these animals employed, those strategies had to account for months in which the primary productivity of the ecosystem, the conversion of sunlight into plant matter, effectively paused. The fossil record from high-latitude Cretaceous sites, including formations in Alaska's North Slope and Australia's Otway Group, environments that, during the Cretaceous, occupied latitudes comparable to Antarctica, provides the closest available proxies for what Antarctic polar dinosaur communities likely resembled. These assemblages are dominated by small to medium-sized ornithopods, hypsilophodontid-grade dinosaurs capable of rapid movement and behavioral flexibility. Their body size skewed smaller than related species from lower latitudes, a pattern consistent with selection pressure, favoring metabolic efficiency in resource-limited environments. Evidence suggests these animals were endothermic, or at minimum, operated with elevated metabolic rates relative to modern reptiles. Bone microstructure in polar ornithopods shows a fibrous, rapidly deposited tissue type, more consistent with warm-blooded physiology than with the slower, more cyclical growth patterns seen in cold-adapted ectotherms. This matters because endothermy, the internal generation and regulation of body heat, would have allowed these animals to remain active during cold, dark winters where an ectothermic animal would have been physiologically incapacitated. Whether full endothermy was universal among polar dinosaur species remains a subject of active research, but the structural evidence from bone tissue is consistent with animals capable of sustaining activity through low temperature, low light conditions. Locomotion through a dense winter forest presented its own demands. The understory vegetation, reduced in light but not entirely absent, created a layered, obstacle-rich environment. Small ornithopods moving through this terrain in near darkness would have relied heavily on non-visual sensory systems. Comparisons with modern birds, the direct evolutionary descendants of theropod dinosaurs, suggest that enlarged olfactory structures and heightened auditory sensitivity may have been present in polar species. Neurological inference from endocast studies, which reconstruct brain cavity geometry from fossil skulls, indicates that some Cretaceous polar theropods possessed enlarged olfactory bulbs relative to overall brain volume, suggesting smell played a primary role in environmental navigation. Group behavior likely amplified individual survival capacity. Trackway evidence from high-latitude Cretaceous sites shows multiple individuals direction across shared substrates, a pattern interpreted as evidence of coordinated group movement. Whether this constituted true herding behavior, opportunistic aggregation, or organized pack dynamics remains uncertain, but the spatial clustering of individuals implied by trackways and bone beds at polar sites suggests these animals did not operate in complete isolation. Movement through the winter forest in groups would have provided advantages in predator detection, navigation, and thermal buffering through huddling or close proximity. Theropod dinosaurs were also present in these high-latitude ecosystems. Their fossil record at polar sites is less abundant than that of herbivorous ornithopods, a distribution consistent with the ecological pyramid in any food web. Predators exist in lower numbers than their prey, but their presence is documented. Isolated theropod teeth, footprints, and fragmentary skeletal elements recovered from Cretaceous polar formations confirm that dinosaurs occupied these environments alongside the herbivores they depended on. A predator operating in polar winter darkness faced a fundamentally different hunting context than one working in the open, well-lit environments typical of lower-latitude Cretaceous ecosystems. Ambush strategies, already common among theropod predators based on limb proportions and sensory anatomy, would have been particularly viable in a densely vegetated, low-visibility forest. Prey animals moving through undergrowth in near darkness were vulnerable to close-range attacks from a predator capable of remaining still and using olfactory or auditory cues to locate them. The forest structure itself, close-spaced trunks, layered ferns, root networks, would have disrupted prey escape trajectories, limiting the effectiveness of flight responses. Seasonal migration, though not supported as a universal strategy by bone histology data, may have occurred in some species or populations. The continent's connection to South America via a land corridor meant that movement northward along the peninsula during the darkest winter months was physically possible. Isotopic analysis of fossil tooth enamel, which records the geochemical signature of water consumed during different phases of an animal's life, has been used in other Cretaceous contexts to detect migratory behavior. Applied to Antarctic specimens, this method could, in principle, distinguish year-round residents from seasonal migrants. though the Antarctic fossil record currently remains too fragmentary for definitive conclusions. What the available evidence does support is a picture of a dinosaur community under sustained selective pressure, unlike anything operating elsewhere on the planet at the same time. These animals were not simply cold weather variants of their lower latitude relatives. They were ecologically and physiologically distinct, shaped over generations by an environment that imposed darkness as a recurring, unavoidable constraint. The polar night was not an obstacle they occasionally encountered. It was a fundamental condition of their existence, as defining to their biology, as the forest itself, and as the soil, and as the slow rivers moving beneath a sky that for months at a time held no light at all, you said. Continue but max 7,000 characters. Every stable ecosystem produces, through the accumulated pressure of evolutionary time, a predator capable of exploiting the largest available prey. The Antarctic Cretaceous was no exception. Above the ornithopods and small theropods that moved through the polar forest, evidence points toward the presence of large carnivorous dinosaurs occupying the uppermost tier of the food web, animals whose size, anatomy, and behavior placed them beyond the reach of any other predator in their environment. Direct fossil evidence from Antarctica itself remains limited by access. The continent's ice cover, averaging 2.1 kilometers in depth, conceals the vast majority of its Cretaceous rock record. What has been recovered comes primarily from exposed formations along the Antarctic Peninsula and the Transantarctic Mountains. Geological windows into a buried world. From these sites, fragmentary remains of large theropod dinosaurs have been identified, including isolated vertebrae, limb elements and teeth consistent with animals in the 6 to 9 meter size range. These specimens have not yet yielded complete skeletons, but their morphology places them within theropod lineages known from contemporaneous South American formations, a distribution that reflects the land connection between the two continents during this period. The closest well-documented relatives come from Patagonia, theropods such as raptor, and related forms from the Turonian and Coniacian stages of the Cretaceous, geological intervals broadly contemporaneous with Antarctic warm period deposits, provide a working anatomical framework for understanding what large Antarctic predators likely resembled. These were not the most massive theropods by global standards. They were, however, fast, structurally robust, and equipped with elongated forelimbs bearing enlarged recurved claws, features consistent with prey restraint rather than purely bite-based predation. In an environment where prey animals moved through dense understory vegetation, restraint-based hunting would have offered significant advantages over pursuit strategies requiring open ground and sustained visibility. The forest itself shaped the predatory options available. Dense coniferous canopy, with a complex fern understory, reduced sightlines to distances of perhaps a few tens of meters in many areas. A large theropod operating in this environment could not rely on the long-distance visual detection and extended pursuit sequences documented for predators in more open Cretaceous habitats. Instead, the available evidence from caribou theropod ecosystems suggests a pattern of slow movement through familiar territory. Exploitation of game trails and river margins, where prey animals concentrated, and short-range ambushes timed to close the distance before prey could accelerate into the understory. River corridors were likely critical zones of predatory activity. Herbivorous dinosaurs, like most large terrestrial vertebrates, required consistent access to water. In a landscape of dense forest interrupted by broad river floodplains, water sources created predictable congregation points. A large theropod positioned along a riverbank or moving through the open floodplain, vegetation bordering a major watercourse, would have encountered prey animals in higher densities than the forest interior provided. Sediment sequences from Antarctic Cretaceous deposits include horizons consistent with floodplain environments, flat-bedded fine-grained layers indicating slow deposition in low-energy aquatic margins, and it is within these transitional zones that predator-prey interaction was most likely concentrated. Territorial behavior among large theropods is inferred from several independent lines of evidence. Bone pathologies, healed fractures, bite marks on skull and jaw elements, and damaged vertebral processes, documented in large theropod specimens from multiple Cretaceous sites, indicate physical conflict between individuals of the same or closely related species. These injuries are consistent with the kinds of contact forces generated during direct confrontation rather than prey capture. Large theropods appear to have fought each other, survived those encounters, and carried the skeletal evidence of those conflicts for the remainder of their lives. In a geographically constrained environment like the Antarctic Peninsula, a relatively narrow landmass extending towards South America, territorial overlap between individuals would have been unavoidable, and competition for prime hunting corridors along rivers and forest margins would have been persistent. The question of sensory capability in large Antarctic theropods connects directly to the darkness problem. A predator whose primary hunting window was compressed into summer months by the physiology of its prey would have faced significant seasonal feast and famine pressure. Conversely, a predator capable of operating through the polar winter, even at reduced efficiency, would have maintained access to prey animals that had nowhere to go. Evidence from theropod neuroanatomy, reconstructed through endocast analysis, indicates that large theropods generally possessed well-developed olfactory systems relative to overall brain volume. In a low-light forest environment, this capacity would have functioned as the primary long-range detection system, allowing a predator to track prey through scent trails persisting in the humid, still air of a dense polar forest. Scavenging likely supplemented active predation, particularly during winter months when prey activity decreased and pursuit hunting became energetically costly. Large body size in theropods confers advantages in food monopolization. A larger animal can defend a carcass from competitors and consume more of it before spoilage or displacement forces abandonment. In an ecosystem experiencing seasonal energy contraction, the ability to locate and exploit carcasses through olfactory detection over distances of several hundred meters would have represented a meaningful survival advantage. The ecological isolation of Antarctica during the later Cretaceous, gradually increasing as the land connection to South America narrowed, introduced an additional selective pressure absent in more connected ecosystems. Gene flow between Antarctic predator populations and their South American relatives decreased over time. Populations became smaller and more geographically constrained. In isolated ecosystems, evolutionary change can accelerate under the influence of genetic drift and localized selective pressures. It is plausible, though not yet confirmed by sufficient fossil material, that Antarctic large theropods were diverging toward distinct morphological forms by the latest Cretaceous. Animals shaped not just by the general conditions of the period, but by the specific, unusual demands of a forested polar continent at the edge of the world. What the available record establishes, across fragmentary but consistent evidence, is that the Antarctic Cretaceous food web was complete. It was not a simplified species-poor system clinging to marginal conditions. It supported large herbivores in sufficient density to sustain large predators. It generated enough biological complexity to produce territorial competition, specialized sensory adaptations, and the kind of ecological stratification associated with mature, stable biomes. The predators at its apex were not anomalies. They were the predictable product of a functioning ecosystem, shaped over millions of years by the same forces that produced apex predators everywhere else on Earth, with the additional constraint that here, for months at a time, the world went dark, and survival depended on continuing regardless. You said, continue, but max 7,000 characters. There is a condition unique to high-latitude environments that no amount of warmth can eliminate. It is not temperature. It is not moisture. It is the geometry of the Earth's axial tilt interacting with orbital mechanics to produce, at latitudes beyond approximately 66 degrees, a period during which the sun does not rise at all. In the mid-Cretaceous, Antarctica sat well within this zone. The forests were dense, the rivers were full, the soil was alive. And for somewhere between 2 and 4 months each year, the entire continent existed in continuous darkness. This was not gradual dimming. The transition from the long, low-angled summer days to the polar night followed a predictable astronomical schedule, compressing from shortened days into complete absence of sunlight over a period of weeks. Average light levels dropped to zero. Photosynthesis across the canopy ceased entirely. The biological engine driving primary productivity, the conversion of solar energy into plant matter that fed every other level of the food web, switched off on a continental scale. The physical consequences followed in sequence. Without solar input, surface temperatures fell. Current paleoclimate models, reconstructing mid-Cretaceous polar conditions, estimate winter temperatures in lowland Antarctic zones dropping to somewhere between 0 and 5 degrees Celsius during the darkest months, even under the elevated greenhouse conditions of the period. In higher elevation areas and interior regions, further from the moderating influence of coastal ocean heat, temperatures likely fell below freezing for extended intervals. Frost formed on vegetation. Shallow water bodies developed ice margins. The soil surface cooled, slowing microbial decomposition and reducing nutrient cycling through the upper organic layers. Fog became a persistent feature of the landscape during these transitional periods. As warmer, moisture-laden air from coastal regions moved inland over cooling ground surfaces, condensation occurred at low altitudes, filling river valleys and forest basins with dense, immobile fog banks. Visibility in the forest interior would have dropped to near zero. An environment already dark from the absence of sunlight further obscured by suspended water vapor moving slowly between tree trunks and across the forest floor. The atmosphere during Antarctic polar winter was not simply dark. It was dense, wet, cold, and almost completely silent in the absence of insect activity and reduced vertebrate movement. Plant responses to this cycle were not passive. The species composing the Antarctic Cretaceous forest were not tropical organisms caught unprepared by seasonal darkness. They were adapted to it, shaped over millions of years of polar existence into organisms capable of surviving complete photosynthetic shutdown. Deciduous strategies, the controlled shedding of leaves prior to winter, reducing metabolic demand during the non-productive dark period, appear to have been common among Antarctic Cretaceous flora. Fossil leaf assemblages recovered from high latitude Cretaceous deposits show high proportions of entire margined, broad-leafed forms consistent with deciduous habit, alongside evergreen coniferous species capable of retaining needles through winter at low metabolic cost. The result was a forest that transformed on a seasonal schedule. Summer brought dense, layered canopy, high humidity, continuous low-angle sunlight cycling around the horizon for weeks, and intense biological activity compressed into a productive window of perhaps 6 to 8 months. Winter brought bare deciduous branches, reduced canopy cover, frost on exposed root systems, and the particular quality of silence that descends on ecosystems when their primary energy source has been removed. The contrast between these two states was absolute, and every organism living in this environment had evolved to navigate both. Animal responses to the polar night operated across a spectrum of strategies: hibernation and torpor, the reduction of metabolic rate to conserve energy through periods of resource scarcity, were likely employed by smaller vertebrates and invertebrates. Insects, which depend on ambient temperature for physiological function, would have largely entered dormancy, either as overwintering eggs, pupae, or adults in sheltered microhabitats beneath bark and within soil layers below the frost line. The reduction in insect activity had cascading effects. Insectivorous vertebrates lost their primary food source. Pollination networks, already restructured by the absence of flowering during darkness, ceased entirely. The ecosystem's internal exchange of energy and nutrients contracted to whatever pathways could function without sunlight. Larger vertebrates faced the same energy contraction, without the option of complete metabolic shutdown. The bone histology evidence indicating year-round residency in polar dinosaur populations implies that these animals remained active through winter, which in turn implies they maintained sufficient food intake to sustain endothermic physiology during the coldest and darkest months. How they managed this is not directly preserved in the fossil record, but the ecological logic points towards several overlapping strategies. Dietary flexibility, the ability to shift from preferred food sources to available alternatives, would have been critical. Herbivores capable of processing bark, woody stems, root material, and decaying organic matter when green foliage was unavailable would have had significant survival advantages over strict folivores dependent on fresh leaf material. The atmosphere of the polar winter forest carries a quality that physical description alone does not fully capture, but that the scientific record implies with considerable consistency. It was an environment operating at reduced intensity across every measurable parameter. Temperature down, light absent, sound diminished, chemical signals from vegetation and prey animals compressed into cold, still air that moved slowly through bare trunks and across frozen ground. For animals with highly developed olfactory systems, as the neuroanatomical evidence suggests many polar Cretaceous vertebrates possessed, this stillness may have actually enhanced certain sensory capabilities. Scent trails persisted longer in cold, humid, windless air. Sounds carried further in the absence of insect noise and rustling canopy. The winter forest was not simply a hostile version of the summer forest. It was a different sensory environment, demanding different behavioral responses from every organism navigating it. The seasonal light cycle also imposed a temporal structure on reproduction and development. Species investing energy in offspring needed to align birth or hatching with periods of maximum food availability. The summer months of high productivity. This constraint, operating consistently across millions of years, would have synchronized reproductive cycles across the ecosystem, producing seasonal pulses of new individuals entering the food web simultaneously. The concentration of young, vulnerable animals during summer months would have intensified predator activity during the same period, creating a cyclical pattern of abundance and predation pressure tightly coupled to the astronomical cycle driving light availability. What emerges from this evidence is a portrait of an ecosystem governed by a rhythm more extreme than anything operating in the modern temperate world. The Antarctic Cretaceous forest did not experience mild seasonal variation. It experienced complete photosynthetic shutdown, followed by intense biological reactivation, repeated on an annual schedule for millions of years. Every species present had been filtered through that cycle. Those that could not adapt the metabolic, behavioral, and physiological requirements of polar seasonality did not persist. Those that remained were, in the most precise sense, specialists, organisms built by evolutionary time to inhabit a world where the sun disappeared for months and life continued regardless. You said, continue but max 7,000 characters. Beneath the forest canopy, between the river margins and the dense root networks of the coniferous understory, there existed a category of habitat distinct from both the open floodplain and the closed forest interior. It was the wetland zone, shallow, saturated, chemically complex, and biologic densities that the better documented terrestrial environments of Cretaceous Antarctica only partially reflect. Swamps, backwater channels, oxbow lakes, and seasonally flooded basins covered significant portions of the low-lying Antarctic landscape, and within them lived a community of organisms whose size, diversity, and ecological roles have only recently begun to emerge from the fossil record. Water accumulated in these basins for straightforward physical reasons. The annual rainfall estimates for mid-Cretaceous Antarctica, pi, exceeding 1,000 millimeters in many reconstructions, and with relatively flat topography in certain interior and coastal lowland regions to produce conditions where drainage was slow and standing water persistent. Organic matter accumulated faster than it decomposed. The cooler, shaded margins of these wetlands, building layers of peat and waterlogged sediment that preserved biological material with unusual fidelity. It is partly for this reason that the wetland fossil record were exposed in Antarctic and analogous high-latitude Cretaceous formations some of the most detailed biological information available about life in this environment. Among the most significant inhabitants of these wetland systems were temnospondyle amphibians, a group with deep evolutionary roots extending back to the Permian, more than 250 million years ago. By the Cretaceous, most temnospondyle lineages had declined globally. But in the southern high latitudes, certain groups persisted well beyond their disappearance elsewhere. Fossil material from Cretaceous age deposits in Australia and South America, landmasses sharing the same high-latitude Gondwanan heritage as Antarctica, documents temnospondyles reaching body lengths of 2 to 3 meters, with broad, flat skulls adapted for ambush predation in shallow water. These were not agile pursuit predators. They were patient, low-metabolism ambush specialists, lying motionless in shallow wetland margins and capturing prey, fish, small vertebrates, large invertebrates, with rapid, wide-gape strikes driven by powerful jaw adductor musculature. Their persistence at high latitudes while disappearing from lower latitude environments is ecologically significant. The wetland habitats of polar Gondwana appear to have functioned as refugia, zones of relative stability where ancient lineages survived pressures that eliminated them elsewhere. The cooler temperatures, dense vegetation cover, and high moisture availability of Antarctic wetlands may have reduced competition from the more metabolically active crocodiliform reptiles that dominated warmer, lower latitude aquatic environments during the same period. In the ecological space left partially vacant by reduced crocodiliform pressure, temnospondyles maintained their position as mid to large ambush predators in the wetland food web. Crocodiliforms were nonetheless present. Fragmentary remains and isolated consistent with small to medium-sized crocodiliform reptiles have been recovered from high-latitude Gondwanan Cretaceous sites, and the land connections linking Antarctica to South America and Australia during this period would have allowed dispersal of these lineages southward. The crocodiliforms present in Antarctic wetland environments were likely smaller and more behaviorally flexible than their tropical relatives. Animals capable of tolerating the seasonal temperature fluctuations and periodic resource scarcity characteristic of polar ecosystems. Their coexistence with temnospondyles in the same wetland systems implies ecological partitioning with body size, microhabitat preference, and prey selection differentiating the two groups sufficiently to reduce direct competition. The insect fauna of these wetlands was, by any modern standard, extraordinary. The Cretaceous atmosphere contained oxygen concentrations broadly comparable to modern levels, approximately 30% by some estimates during peak intervals, and the dense, humid vegetation of Antarctic wetlands provided the substrate, moisture, and organic detritus that supported complex invertebrate communities. Dragonfly relatives with wingspans exceeding 15 centimeters are documented from Cretaceous deposits globally. Beetles, flies, and early representatives of several modern insect orders moved through the wetland vegetation in densities that supported entire trophic levels of insectivorous vertebrates. The acoustic environment of an Antarctic Cretaceous swamp during summer, continuous insect activity overlapping with amphibian vocalizations, and the movement of large vertebrates through shallow water would have been among the most biologically intense soundscapes on the planet. Within the wetland margins and the forest floor immediately adjacent to standing water, the first representatives of an evolutionary lineage that would eventually come to dominate the planet were present. Though in forms almost unrecognizable compared to their descendants, early mammals, small, predominantly nocturnal, insectivorous animals with body masses rarely exceeding 50 grams, occupied the ecological space beneath the notice of the large vertebrates around them. Their fossil record in Antarctic Cretaceous deposits is essentially non-existent due to the fragility of their small bones and the limitations of current excavation access, but their presence is inferred from the well-documented mammal faunas of contemporaneous South American and Australian formations connected to Antarctica during this period. These early mammals navigated the wetland margins at ground level, moving through root networks and beneath fern fronds, feeding on insects, worms and small invertebrates, concentrated in the organic-rich soil at the water's edge. Their small size was not a limitation. It was a precise adaptation to a particular ecological niche, one requiring high metabolic rate, rapid reproductive turnover, and the ability to exploit food resources distributed at fine spatial scales across the wetland floor. Their endothermy, well established by the Cretaceous, allowed them to remain active through the cooler periods of the polar seasonal cycle when ectothermic competitors slowed or ceased activity entirely. The wetland ecosystem as a whole functioned as a system of interlocking energy pathways, far more complex than the simplified image of a swamp suggests. Organic matter produced by wetland vegetation entered the food web through multiple simultaneous root shoots, direct herbivory by insects and small vertebrates, microbial decompositions through releasing nutrients back into the water column, filter feeding by invertebrates processing suspended organic particles, and detritivory by organisms consuming partially decomposed plant debris at sedimental to sediment surface. Each of these pathways supported its own community of consumers, and those consumers supported predators operating at progressively higher trophic levels. The physical structure of the wetland also created microhabitat diversity within a relatively small geographic area. Open water channels supported fish and aquatic invertebrates. Floating vegetation mats provided substrate for insects and small reptiles. Reed and fern margins offered cover for amphibians and small theropods moving between aquatic and terrestrial zones. Submerged root networks harbored invertebrate communities largely invisible to surface predators. The three-dimensional complexity of the wetland environment, vertical as much as horizontal, concentrated biological diversity into zones where the transition between water and land created conditions exploitable by organisms adapted to both. What the Antarctic Cretaceous wetlands represent in the full scope of the evidence is not a peripheral or secondary habitat within a predominantly terrestrial ecosystem. They were a distinct and biologically productive environment, operating in parallel with the forest, connected to it through shared species and nutrient flows, but governed by its own physical logic and supporting its own characteristic community of organisms. Ancient lineages persisted here after disappearing elsewhere. Small, evolutionarily significant vertebrates found ecological refuge in their margins. The water held life in forms and densities that the drier forest interior could not sustain. Beneath the surface, largely invisible, the swamps of ancient Antarctica were among the most productive and complex environments on a continent that has since been defined entirely by their absence, you said. Continue, but max 7,000 characters. There is a boundary in vertebrate evolutionary history that tends to organize how the deep past is understood. The moment, approximately 66 million years ago, when non-avian dinosaurs disappeared and mammals began their expansion into the ecological space left vacant by that disappearance. Before that boundary, the world belonged, in terms of large-bodied terrestrial dominance, to the reptiles. Antarctica in the Cretaceous existed entirely on the earlier side of that line. The continent's ecosystems were structured not around the warm-blooded, live-bearing, socially complex mammals that would eventually inherit the Earth, but around a much older and more diverse assemblage of reptilian and near-reptilian life, whose evolutionary experiments were, in many respects, more varied than anything that followed. Among the most ecologically significant non-dinosaurian reptiles present in high-latitude Gondwanan environments were the sphinodontians, a group whose modern survivors are represented by a single living species, the tuatara of New Zealand. During the Cretaceous, sphinodontians were globally distributed and ecologically diverse, occupying herbivorous, insectivorous, and possibly omnivorous niches across a range of body sizes. Their presence in Antarctic ecosystems is inferred from their well-documented distribution across Gondwanan landmasses during this period. These were slow-metabolizing, long-lived animals capable of persisting through periods of reduced food availability, a characteristic that would have been directly relevant to survival through Antarctic polar winters. Their persistence into the modern era in New Zealand, itself a Gondwanan fragment, suggests a particular resilience to the kinds of climatic and ecological pressures that eliminated most of their relatives elsewhere. The dinosaurs occupying Antarctica's forests and wetlands were themselves only one component of this broader reptilian dominance. Alongside them, and in some ecological zones largely independent of them, lived lineages whose body plans, physiological strategies, and ecological roles reflected hundreds of millions of years of separate evolutionary history. Understanding the Antarctic Cretaceous ecosystem requires moving beyond the familiar dinosaur framework and accounting for the full scope of reptilian diversity that the continent supported. Alongside the sphinodontians, various lizard lineages occupied the smaller vertebrate niches of the Antarctic forest floor and wetland margins. The Cretaceous was a period of significant lizard diversification globally, and the land connections linking Antarctica to South America and Australia provided dispersal pathways for lineages evolving across the broader Gondwanan region. The animals operated at spatial trophic scales, largely below those occupied by the dinosaurs, feeding on insects, small invertebrates, and plant material, sheltering within root networks and beneath fallen timber, and representing an ecological layer of fine-grained biological activity that the larger vertebrate record tends to obscure. The bird lineages present in Antarctic Cretaceous environments deserve particular attention. Birds, the direct evolutionary descendants of theropod dinosaurs, were already diversifying rapidly by the mid to late Cretaceous. Several distinct lineages had evolved, including the Enantiornithines, a group of toothed birds that represented the dominant avian clade of the Cretaceous, and whose fossil record extends across multiple continents. Evidence for bird presence in high-latitude Gondwanan environments comes from isolate bones and footprints recovered from Antarctic Peninsula formations and contemporaneous Australian deposits. These early birds occupied ecological roles broadly analogous to modern small birds: insectivory, seed consumption where available, and possibly fish predation along wetland margins. But their anatomy retained features, including teeth and clawed wing digits, reflecting their recent theropod ancestry. The Enantiornithines would not survive the end Cretaceous extinction. Their disappearance, alongside the non-avian dinosaurs, left the avian ecological space to be repopulated entirely by the Neornithine lineage. The modern bird group, whose Antarctic representatives today include penguins, petrels, and albatrosses. The distance between a toothed Cretaceous forest bird moving through Antarctic conifer canopy and a modern penguin navigating pack ice represents one of the most complete ecological transformations documented in the vertebrate fossil record. Pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that had dominated aerial ecological niches since the Triassic, were also present in the Antarctic Cretaceous, though their fossil record on the continent remains fragmentary. Pterosaur bones recovered from Antarctic Peninsula. Formations include elements consistent with medium to large-bodied forms, and their global distribution during the Cretaceous makes their presence in Antarctic skies essentially certain. Large pterosaurs soaring above a forested Antarctic coastline, exploiting thermal columns rising from the warm, vegetation-covered surface and descending to feed along river margins and coastal wetlands, represent a component of the Antarctic ecosystem that the terrestrial fossil record alone cannot fully reconstruct. Their ecological role, large aerial predators and scavengers operating across landscape scales, had no direct equivalent among the mammals that later inherited the continent's skies. The absence of large mammals from this ecosystem is not simply a gap in the record. It reflects a genuine ecological reality. The mammals present in Cretaceous Antarctica were small, nocturnal, and ecologically marginal relative to the reptilian lineages occupying the dominant niches. Their smallness was not temporary. It was a stable condition maintained across the entire Mesozoic by competitive exclusion. The process by which established, well-adapted organisms prevent newcomers from accessing the ecological space they occupy. Large reptilian herbivores held the primary consumer niches. Large theropods held the apex predator niches. The physical and behavioral capabilities of these animals, refined across more than 100 million years of dinosaurian evolution, represented barriers to mammalian ecological expansion that no Cretaceous mammal possessed the body size, metabolic capacity, or reproductive rate to overcome. This competitive landscape had a structural consequence that extended beyond body size. Mammalian evolution during the Cretaceous was channeled into the spaces that reptilian dominance left open. Nocturnality, small body size, dietary flexibility, and rapid reproduction. These constraints, imposed by ecological exclusion rather than intrinsic mammalian limitation, paradoxically generated the physiological and behavioral toolkit that would allow mammals to diversify explosively once the constraints were removed. The small insectivores sheltering beneath Antarctic ferns were not simply surviving. They were accumulating, through generations of selection, under competitive pressure, the characteristics that would eventually define the dominant vertebrate lineage of the Cenozoic. The reptilian world of Antarctic Cretaceous, diverse, ecologically complete, and stable across timescales measured in tens of millions of years, was not a primitive precursor to something better. It was a fully realized biological system, organized around evolutionary lineages with deep histories and sophisticated adaptations. Its complexity was not less than what followed. In several respects, particularly in the range of body plans and ecological strategies it supported, it exceeded it. The mammals waiting in its margins were not the future asserting itself. They were small animals in a world that did not yet belong to them, surviving at the edges of an ecosystem built and maintained entirely by the reptiles that came before. You said, continue, but max 7,000 characters. The terrestrial record of ancient Antarctica, its forests, wetlands, and the animals moving through them, represents only one dimension of a far larger biological system. Surrounding the continent, extending outward across what are now the Southern Ocean, the Weddell Sea, and the basins flanking the Antarctic Peninsula lay a marine environment of extraordinary productivity and complexity. These were not cold, nutrient-poor waters. They were warm, chemically active, and populated by predators and prey operating across size, ranges, and ecological roles that have no direct equivalent in the modern Southern Ocean. The seas around Cretaceous Antarctica were, in measurable biological terms, among the most active marine environments on the planet. Sea surface temperatures in the higher latitude Cretaceous oceans are reconstructed from oxygen isotope ratios, preserved in the carbonate shells of fossil foraminifera, microscopic marine organisms, whose skeletal chemistry records the temperature of the water in which they formed. These proxies consistently indicate sea surface temperatures in the Antarctic region during the mid-Cretaceous of between 15 and 20 degrees Celsius, with some estimates for the warmest intervals reaching higher. Bottom water temperatures, reconstructed from deep-sea sediment cores, were similarly elevated relative to modern conditions. The thermal gradient between equatorial and polar oceans was substantially compressed compared to today, meaning that warm water masses extended much further toward the poles before cooling significantly. The circumpolar current that today isolates Antarctic waters and drives their extreme cold did not yet exist. Ocean circulation was fundamentally different, and the waters surrounding Antarctica reflected that difference directly. Within these warm, well-mixed waters, primary productivity was high. Phytoplankton communities, fueled by nutrient upwelling along the continental margins, and the abundant dissolved minerals cycling through a geologically active ocean, formed the base of a food web extending upward through zooplankton, fish, and ultimately to the large marine reptiles that occupied the apex of the Cretaceous marine ecosystem. The diversity of life supported by these waters is documented in marine sediment sequences exposed along the Antarctic coastline and in drill cores recovered from the surrounding ocean floor. Records that, though incomplete, consistently indicate a biologically dense and ecologically stratified marine environment. Ammonites were among the most abundant and ecologically significant invertebrates in these seas. These free-swimming cephalopods, relatives of the modern nautilus, but far more diverse in shell morphology and likely in behavior, reached extraordinary size and numerical abundance in Cretaceous marine environments globally, and the waters around Antarctica were no exception. Ammonite shells recovered from Antarctic Cretaceous marine deposits range from a few centimeters to over a meter in diameter, representing animals spanning multiple trophic levels, from small zooplankton feeders to large predators capable of capturing substantial prey. Their shells, coiled in geometrically precise logarithmic spirals, accumulated on the sea floor in densities visible in certain Antarctic marine sediment exposures as continuous shell-rich horizons. Layers representing millions of individuals deposited over extended time intervals. The predators feeding on ammonites and the fish populations of the Antarctic Cretaceous seas were, in several cases, among the largest marine reptiles known from the fossil record. Plesiosaurs, long-necked, four-flippered marine reptiles that had diversified extensively since their Triassic origins, were present in Antarctic waters throughout much of the Cretaceous. Their fossil record on the continent is among the most substantial of any marine vertebrate group, with numerous specimens from James Ross Island and surrounding formations representing multiple species across a range of body sizes. The largest plesiosaur specimens from Antarctic deposits indicate animals exceeding 10 meters in total length, with the elongated neck alone accounting for a significant portion of that measurement in the elasmosaurid forms. Elasmosaurids, the long-necked plesiosaur lineage, likely fed by extending their necks rapidly into fish schools or ammonite aggregations, using the inertia of their heavy body as an anchor, while the neck swept through prey concentrations too dense and fast-moving for whole-body pursuit to be effective. This feeding strategy, inferred from neck vertebra morphology and the biomechanical constraints of their skeletal geometry, would have been particularly effective in the productive surface waters of the Antarctic continental shelf, where seasonal plankton blooms concentrated fish in predictable zones. Short-necked plesiosaurs, the polycotyledonid and pliosaurid forms, occupied a different ecological role, using robust skulls and powerful jaw musculature to take larger, more resistant prey including large fish, cephalopods, and possibly other marine reptiles. Mosasaurs, large, fully aquatic lizards that expanded rapidly through marine environments during the later Cretaceous, also entered Antarctic waters as their global distribution broadened. Mosasaur remains from Antarctic marine deposits indicate animals in the 6 to 10 meter range, streamlined and fast-moving, with jaws bearing multiple rows of robust conical teeth, adapted for seizing and processing large prey. Unlike the plesiosaurs, whose body plan remained relatively conservative across their evolutionary history, mosasaurs were recent and rapid radiators, a lineage that had transitioned from coastal semi-aquatic ancestors to fully pelagic ocean predators within a geologically brief interval. Their presence in Antarctic waters by the late Cretaceous reflects the speed of their ecological expansion and the accessibility of the warm southern seas to colonization from lower latitudes. The coastline itself was a zone of intense biological activity, where the forested terrestrial environment met the marine system. Nutrients from river discharge and terrestrial organic matter entered the water column, driving elevated productivity in nearshore zones. Estuaries and coastal wetlands extending into shallow marine margins supported dense communities of fish, invertebrates, and the marine reptiles feeding on them. Large pterosaurs working coastal thermals and descending to feed at the water surface would have concentrated in these productive nearshore zones. Terrestrial dinosaurs moving to coastal margins for water or food would have encountered the marine system directly at these boundaries. The separation between the terrestrial and marine ecosystems of Cretaceous Antarctica was not a hard boundary. It was a gradient, crossed regularly by organisms moving between systems. Storm systems moving across the warm Cretaceous Southern Ocean generated significant wave energy along Antarctic coastlines. The absence of the modern circumpolar current meant that storm tracks and wave patterns differed substantially from today, but the thermal contrast between warm ocean surfaces and the cooler air masses building over the continent during autumn and winter would have driven substantial atmospheric disturbance. Coastal erosion, sediment transport, and the physical disturbance of near-shore marine habitats by storm energy were regular features of the Antarctic Cretaceous coastal environment, creating a dynamic physical context within which the biological communities of the coastal zone operated. What the marine record around Antarctica ultimately documents is a system of scale and complexity, proportional to the terrestrial environment it surrounded. The seas were not a backdrop to the story of the continent. They were a parallel ecosystem of equivalent biological richness, connected to the land through nutrient flows, shared coastlines, and the movement of organisms across the boundary between water and shore. Together, the forest and the ocean formed an integrated system, warm, productive, and biologically dense from the canopy to the seafloor, whose character was defined as much by the water surrounding it as by the land at its center. You said, continue, but max 7,000 characters. Beneath the forests and wetlands of Cretaceous Antarctica, and beneath the warm seas surrounding the continent, geological forces were operating on timescales that dwarfed the biological ones. The continent was not geologically stable. It was positioned within a broader tectonic framework that had been producing volcanism across the Gondwanan region for tens of millions of years. preserved in Antarctic rock sequences indicates that volcanic activity reached the surface repeatedly throughout the period when the continent's ecosystems were at their most biologically complex. Fire and biology occupied the same landscape simultaneously, and the interactions between them shaped both the physical environment and the organisms living within it in ways that the fossil record has only partially resolved. The volcanic history of Antarctica during the Mesozoic is documented through several independent lines of evidence. Igneous intrusions, bodies of solidified magma that forced their way into existing rock sequences without reaching the surface, are exposed in the Transantarctic Mountains and along the Antarctic Peninsula in volumes indicating sustained subsurface magmatic activity across extended time intervals. Where magma did reach the surface, lava flows and pyroclastic deposits are preserved in sequences interbedded with the sedimentary rocks containing biological fossils, establishing direct temporal relationships between volcanic events and the ecosystems they affected. Ash layers as thin, chemically distinct horizons of volcanic clasts and mineral fragments deposited from atmospheric dispersal following eruptions appear repeatedly in Antarctic Cretaceous sediment sequences, each one marking a specific eruptive event whose regional or continental effects can be estimated from the layer's thickness and geographic distribution. The volcanic activity most directly relevant to Antarctic Cretaceous ecosystems was not produced by isolated, randomly distributed eruptions. It was connected to the broader process of Gondwanan fragmentation, the tectonic breakup of the southern supercontinent that had begun in the Triassic and continued through the Cretaceous, as the constituent landmasses of Gondwana, South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica separated along rifting boundaries. Magma rose through the thinning and fracturing crust at rift margins. The separation of Antarctica from other Gondwanan fragments was not a clean, silent geological process. It was accompanied by sustained magmatic activity along the developing ocean floor and at continental margins, producing volcanism that affected atmospheric chemistry, local temperature regimes, and the physical stability of the landscapes above. Lava flows reaching the forest surface would have produced immediate and localized destruction. Basaltic lava, moving at rates between a few meters per hour in slow-moving flows to several kilometers per hour in faster, channelized streams, would have incinerated standing vegetation, sterilized soil biota, and converted living forest into bare rock across areas ranging from tens to hundreds of square kilometers depending on eruption, volume, and topographic channeling. The immediate aftermath of a significant lava flow would have been a sterile landscape, black, hot, and devoid of the biological complexity that had accumulated over thousands of years of forest development. The recovery of vegetation on cooled lava surfaces follows a documented succession sequence. Pioneer species, typically ferns and spore-bearing plants with lightweight, widely dispersed reproductive propagules, colonize bare rock surfaces first, beginning the process of biological soil formation. In a Cretaceous Antarctic context, the fern and horsetail component of the flora, already dominant in the forest understory, would have been among the first colonizers of post-volcanic surfaces. Pollen and spore records from sections immediately above volcanic horizons in some Cretaceous sequences show precisely this pattern. A temporary increase in fern spore abundance relative to pollen from woody plants, representing the fern spike that characterizes biological recovery following surface sterilizing events. Full forest recovery, involving the re-establishment of coniferous canopy and the complex understory layers beneath it, would have required centuries to millennia, depending on proximity to surviving forest seed sources. Pyroclastic events, explosive eruptions producing rapidly moving flows of hot gas, ash, and rock fragments, would have had more extensive and more immediately lethal effects than lava flows alone. The deposits of pyroclastic origin identifiable in Antarctic Cretaceous sequences indicate eruptions capable of dispersing significant volumes of material across regional scales. Ash fallout from major eruptions, settling over forest canopy, would have coated leaf surfaces, reducing photosynthetic efficiency and increasing structural load on branches. Sufficient ash accumulation kills vegetation not through heat but through physical smothering and the alteration of soil chemistry as ash weathers into the substrate. Sulfur dioxide released during large eruptions reacts with atmospheric water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols, which reflect incoming solar radiation and produce short-term surface cooling, volcanic winters lasting months to years depending on eruption magnitude. The effect of repeated volcanic winters on an ecosystem already adapted to seasonal darkness is complex. Antarctic Cretaceous organisms had evolved the capacity to survive extended periods of reduced solar input and the mechanisms supporting that survival. Metabolic reduction, dietary flexibility, stored energy reserves would have provided some buffer against volcanically induced cooling and light reduction. However, volcanic winters imposed their darkness and cooling on an unpredictable schedule outside the regular astronomical cycle to which Antarctic ecosystems were adapted. An ecosystem prepared for winter darkness beginning in a predictable month each year faced a different challenge when volcanic aerosols produced light reduction and cooling during summer, the period of maximum biological productivity on which the entire system depended for annual energy accumulation. Hydrothermal activity associated with volcanic systems introduced chemically altered water into river systems and groundwater. Elevated concentrations of sulfur compounds, heavy metals, and dissolved minerals from hydrothermal sources would have created locally toxic conditions in affected waterways, reducing fish and invertebrate populations in impacted drainages while potentially concentrating surviving aquatic organisms in unaffected systems downstream. The wetland communities dependent on clean, nutrient-balanced water inputs would have been sensitive to these chemical perturbations, and the fossil record from intervals of elevated volcanic activity in Antarctic sequences may eventually reveal systematic changes in wetland faunal composition corresponding to hydrothermal contamination events. Despite these disruptions, the Antarctic ecosystem persisted through repeated volcanic events across tens of millions of years. The evidence for this persistence is embedded in the continuity of the biological record. The fact that forest sediments, pollen sequences, and vertebrate fossil assemblages continue through and above volcanic horizons without evidence of permanent regional extinction. Volcanism was a recurring disturbance within a resilient system, not a terminal event. The forests recolonized lava fields. The wetlands restabilized after chemical perturbation. The vertebrate communities, drawing on the behavioral and physiological flexibility that polar seasonality had already demanded of them, absorbed volcanic disruptions as one more category of environmental variability, requiring adaptive response. The geological forces driving this volcanism were simultaneously dismantling the continental configuration that had created the Antarctic ecosystem in the first place. Each rifting event that produced magma at a continental margin was also widening the ocean basins separating Antarctica from its Gondwanan neighbors, reducing the land connections that allowed species exchange, and progressively isolating the continent within an expanding ring of open ocean. The fire emerging from the ground and the slow drift of the continent away from its geological relatives were expressions of the same underlying tectonic process, one operating at the surface in intervals of years, the other operating at depth across intervals of millions of years, both moving toward the same eventual outcome. You said, continue but max 7,000 characters. Tectonic drift operates beyond the threshold of direct human perception. The rates involved typically between 1 and 10 centimeters per year for active plate boundaries, produce no observable surface effect on timescales shorter than thousands of years. Yet accumulated across tens of millions of years, these rates generate continental displacements of thousands of kilometers, reconfigure ocean basins, redirect global heat transport systems, and fundamentally alter the climatic conditions of every landmass involved. For Antarctica, the process of tectonic isolation was not merely a geographical event. It was the mechanism by which one of the most biologically complex environments in Earth's history was systematically dismantled. Not through sudden catastrophe, but through the slow, continuous physics of a planet, reorganizing its surface. During the early Cretaceous, Antarctica was not isolated. It occupied a central position within the remnant of Gondwana, connected along its western margin to South America and maintaining proximity to Australia along its eastern margin. These connections were not simply land bridges in the narrow sense. They were broad continental junctions across which entire faunal and floral communities exchanged genes, individuals, and evolutionary innovations. Species moving between Antarctica and South America did not cross a barrier. They moved through continuous habitat, following river systems, forest corridors, and coastal margins that linked the two landmasses without interruption. The biological communities of Antarctic Cretaceous ecosystems were not isolated endemics. They were part of a larger Gondwanan biological province, whose diversity was maintained by this ongoing exchange. The separation began gradually. Rifting between Antarctica and Australia initiated during the Cretaceous, with the two landmasses beginning to move apart along a developing ocean basin. Initial separation rates were slow, and for tens of millions of years, the opening ocean between them remained shallow and narrow enough that some biological exchange may have continued via island chains or coastal dispersal. The critical threshold, the point at which deep water circulation could establish itself between the separating continents, was not crossed until significantly later. But the biological consequences of even partial separation began accumulating well before full oceanographic isolation was achieved. The connection between Antarctica and South America persisted longer. The Drake Passage, the body of water now separating the Antarctic Peninsula from the southern tip of South America, did not open to deep water circulation until approximately 30 to 34 million years ago, well after the end of the Cretaceous. During the Cretaceous itself, the land connection remained intact, though geological evidence indicates it was narrowing and becoming more tectonically active as the separation process progressed. A narrowing land corridor functions differently from a broad continental connection in biological terms. As the corridor contracted, it would have filtered the exchange of species. Large-bodied animals requiring extensive continuous habitat would have been affected before small, mobile, or ecologically flexible organisms capable of traversing a narrower passage. The oceanographic consequences of progressive Antarctic isolation were more significant than the biological exchange effects alone. As Antarctica separated from Australia and the gap between them deepened, ocean water began circulating through the developing passage. Initially, this circulation was shallow and warm, drawing surface water from lower latitudes around the eastern Antarctic margin. As the passage deepened and widened, deeper and colder water masses gained access to the circuit. The proto-circumpolar current, the precursor to the Antarctic circumpolar current that today dominates Southern Ocean circulation, began to organize itself around the continent. The physical consequences of circumpolar circulation for Antarctic climate are well understood from oceanographic modeling and proxy records. A continuous current encircling the continent acts as a thermal barrier, reducing the poleward transport of warm water from lower latitudes. Before the circumpolar current established itself, warm subtropical water masses could penetrate toward Antarctic margins, moderating coastal temperatures and contributing to the mild conditions that sustained the continent's forests. As the current strengthened, this poleward heat transport was progressively curtailed. Sea surface temperatures around Antarctica began to fall. The thermal buffering that had kept Antarctic coastal environments warm even through polar winters diminished incrementally with each increase in circumpolar current intensity. Terrestrial temperature followed marine temperature downward, with a lag determined by the thermal inertia of the continental interior. The forests of Antarctica did not die immediately as the surrounding ocean cooled. They responded through gradual compositional change. Cold-sensitive species retreating from the highest latitudes first, replaced by more cold-tolerant forms that could maintain photosynthetic activity at lower temperatures. Pollen records from Antarctic sediment sequences spanning the late Cretaceous and early Paleogene show precisely this pattern of compositional shift, with warm-adapted flora declining and cool-adapted taxa increasing in relative abundance over millions of years. The change was not abrupt. It was a slow substitution, forest type, replacing forest type across latitudinal gradients as the thermal envelope supporting each community contracted toward lower latitudes. Species unable to track their climate envelope through migration faced local extinction. As Antarctica isolated further and the land connection to South America narrowed, the escape routes available to organisms requiring warmer conditions contracted. A population of warm-adapted reptiles in central Antarctica during the late Cretaceous faced a choice that already decided: move toward the coast and toward the narrowing connection with South America, or remain and adapt to conditions that were slowly becoming incompatible with their physiology. The fossil record captures the outcome of this pressure in the declining diversity of Antarctic vertebrate assemblages through the later Cretaceous, as the variety of reptilian lineages documented in earlier deposits gradually reduces to a more restricted set of cold-tolerant forms. The isolation of Antarctica also affected evolutionary dynamics within the continent. As gene flow with South American and Australian populations decreased, Antarctic populations of shared species began diverging. Reduced immigration meant that locally adapted variants were less frequently diluted by migrants carrying genes from different selective environments. Genetic drift, random changes in allele frequency amplified in small, isolated populations, accelerated divergence independently of selective pressure. The biological communities of late Cretaceous Antarctica were becoming increasingly distinct from their closest relatives elsewhere, shaped by a combination of local selective pressure and the evolutionary consequences of isolation that tectonic drift had imposed upon them. The same process that was isolating Antarctica biologically through volcanism at rift margins and the reorganization of ocean circulation, beginning to alter global climate in ways that extended far beyond the Antarctic region. The establishment of cold Antarctic bottom water, dense, cold water sinking at the Antarctic margin and spreading along the ocean floor toward lower latitudes, represented a fundamental change in global ocean circulation, with temperature consequences felt across the entire planet. Antarctica's drift into isolation was not simply a local event with local consequences. It was a reorganization of one of Earth's primary heat distribution systems, and its effects propagated outward through the ocean and atmosphere to influence climates thousands of kilometers from the continent itself. The slow physics of continental drift had set in motion a sequence of changes that no biological adaptation could ultimately reverse. The forests could adjust their composition, the animals could shift their ranges, the ecosystem could absorb decades and centuries of incremental cooling through the flexibility that millions of years of polar existence had built into its organisms. But the underlying driver, the progressive isolation of a continent within a strengthening ring of cold circulating ocean, was operating on time scales and at energy scales entirely outside the reach of biological response. The continent was moving, the ocean was reorganizing, and the world that had existed on the ice-free Antarctic surface for tens of millions of years was approaching, with geological inevitability, its end. You said, continue but max 7,000 characters. Ecosystems do not collapse without warning. Before the final deterioration of a biome, before the population crashes and the extinction pulses mark its termination in the fossil record, there is a period of progressive stress, a phase during which the system continues to function while the conditions sustaining it move incrementally outside the range its organisms can tolerate. This phase leaves traces. It appears in declining species diversity within sediment sequences, in changing body size distributions among vertebrate populations, in the compositional drift of plant communities recorded in pollen records, and in the geochemical signatures of soils and sediments responding to altered temperature and moisture regimes. For Antarctica, this early warning phase is preserved partially and fragmentarily in the rock sequences spanning the final stages of the Cretaceous and the early Paleogene, a geological interval during which the continent's ecosystems began their long contraction toward the frozen state that defines Antarctica today. The first measurable signal appears in temperature proxies. Oxygen isotope records from Antarctic marine sediments spanning the late Cretaceous show a gradual shift toward isotopic ratios, indicating cooler sea surface temperatures relative to the mid-Cretaceous peak. The change was not linear. It proceeded through intervals of relative stability, punctuated by episodes of more rapid cooling, suggesting that the thermal decline was driven by multiple interacting mechanisms operating on different timescales rather than a single continuous forcing. Ocean circulation changes associated with the progressive opening of the passages separating Antarctica from Australia contributed on longer timescales. Variations in atmospheric CO2 concentrations contributed on shorter ones. The net trajectory across millions of years was downward, and the biological consequences tracked the temperature signal with increasing fidelity as the cooling progressed. Vegetation responded first and most legibly. Pollen sequences from Antarctic sediment cores and exposed rock sections spanning the late Cretaceous show the gradual disappearance of thermophilic, heat-preferring plant taxa from assemblages that had them consistently through the warmer earlier periods. Broad-leafed angiosperm species adapted to warm, humid conditions declined in relative abundance. Cool-tolerant conifers and ferns, already present in the Antarctic flora due to the demands of polar seasonality, increased their proportional representation. The forest did not disappear. It changed character, moving from a mixed assemblage of warm, adapted, and cold-tolerant species toward a community dominated increasingly by the cold-tolerant end of the spectrum. The canopy became less diverse. The understory simplified. The range of ecological niches supported by the vegetation contracted as the plant community itself narrowed. This vegetational simplification had direct consequences for the animals dependent on it. Herbivorous dinosaurs, whose dietary preferences included the broad-leafed angiosperms declining from the flora, faced reduced food availability as those plants retreated. Dietary generalists, animals capable of processing a wider range of plant material, would have been less immediately affected than specialists, the selective pressure favoring dietary flexibility. Already strong in a polar ecosystem subject to seasonal food scarcity, intensified as the permanent reduction in plant diversity began to overlap with the existing seasonal reduction. Animals that had previously experienced food limitation only during winter months now faced year-round compression of their dietary options. Body size distributions within herbivore populations show sensitivity to this kind of nutritional stress. Paleontological evidence from other Cretaceous high-latitude environments experiencing late Cretaceous post-cooling suggests a trend toward reduced average body size in herbivorous dinosaur populations, consistent with the Bergmann's rule inverse effect under nutritional rather than thermal stress. Animals, constrained by food availability, trend smaller as population-level selection favors individuals with lower absolute energy requirements. Whether this pattern is directly documented in Antarctic specimens remains limited by the fragmentary nature of the continental fossil record. But the ecological logic applies with particular force to a population already operating at the margins of energetic viability in a polar environment. Predator populations responded to herbivore stress indirectly but measurably. A reduction in herbivore biomass, the total mass of plant-eating animals available as prey, reduces the carrying capacity of the ecosystem for predators. Large theropods requiring substantial prey intake to sustain endothermic metabolism would have been among the first to experience the consequences of declining herbivore populations. Population density of apex predators, always low relative to prey, would have fallen further. Individuals would have ranged across larger territories to meet energy requirements. Encounter rates between predators and prey would have decreased, increasing the energetic cost of each successful hunt. The evidence for this pressure is indirect, preserved in the declining diversity of theropod, remains in later Antarctic deposits. But the mechanism is consistent with predator-prey dynamics, documented across multiple extinction contexts in the fossil record. The marine environment surrounding Antarctica registered the cooling in parallel. Sea surface temperature decline affected the thermal structure of the water column, altering the depth distribution of nutrients and the productivity of phytoplankton communities. Ammonite diversity, already showing global decline, through the latest Cretaceous, for reasons connected to broader oceanographic changes, contracted further in Antarctic waters as thermal conditions moved outside the tolerance ranges of warm-adapted species. The large marine reptiles, plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, faced prey base reductions as the productivity of the marine system declined with cooling. Their fossil record in Antarctic marine sequences thins toward the end of the Cretaceous, a pattern consistent with population reduction under sustained ecological stress rather than sudden catastrophic removal. Seasonal extremes intensified as the mean temperature declined. An ecosystem whose organisms had evolved to tolerate a specific range of seasonal variation. Warm summers, cold but survivable winters experienced progressive stress, and as winter temperatures dropped below the thresholds those organisms had been shaped to endure. The cold tolerance built into Antarctic Cretaceous species through millions of years of polar adaptation was not unlimited. It had been calibrated to the range of conditions that existed during the warmer Cretaceous climate. As that range shifted downward, the buffer between experienced winter temperatures and lethal thresholds narrowed. Species with the least cold tolerance were eliminated first, from the highest latitudes and the most exposed environments, retreating or disappearing before the more cold-tolerant forms that persisted longer. Migration corridors became critical as interior habitats deteriorated ahead of coastal zones, which retained some thermal buffering from the still warm ocean. Animals moving toward the coast and toward the narrowing land connection with South America would have encountered increasing population densities in the remaining viable habitat. Competition for food, space, and shelter intensifying as the geographic range of tolerable conditions contracted. The behavioral and physiological flexibility that had sustained Antarctic ecosystem through millions of years of polar seasonality was being tested against a new kind of challenge, not the predictable, reversible darkness of winter, but the irreversible, directional contraction of the thermal envelope within which the entire system had been built. The forest was thinning. The winters were lengthening. The margin between survival and failure was narrowing with each passing millennium. and the geological forces driving that narrowing showed no indication of reversal, you said. Continue, but max 7,000 characters. At the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene periods, approximately 66 million years ago, a bolide, approximately 6 kilometers in diameter, struck the shallow marine platform of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula at an estimated velocity of 20 kilometers per second. The energy released by that impact has been calculated at roughly 100 teratons of TNT equivalent, a magnitude sufficient to vaporize the impactor itself, excavate a crater over 150 kilometers in diameter, and inject sufficient material into the atmosphere to alter the radiative balance of the entire planet within weeks. The event that followed was not regional. It was global, and its effects reached Antarctica with the same physical inevitability as every other point on the Earth's surface. The immediate atmospheric consequences are well constrained by physical modeling and the global stratigraphic record. Ejecta lofted into the upper atmosphere, distributed fine particulate material around the planet within days to weeks, reducing incoming solar radiation at the surface to a fraction of normal levels. Photosynthesis collapsed globally. In Antarctica, where the polar ecosystem had already evolved mechanisms for surviving months of seasonal darkness, this sudden light reduction arrived without the biological preparation that astronomical winter provided. The organisms that had developed strategies for enduring predictable, seasonally timed darkness encountered, instead, an abrupt, unpredictable shutdown imposed at a random point in the annual cycle. For some populations, during the summer productive period on which the entire year's energy budget depended, surface temperatures fell rapidly following the impact. Global mean temperature decline estimates derived from climate models and geochemical proxies range from 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in the months immediately following the impact, with recovery proceeding over years to decades depending on the clearing of atmospheric particulates. For Antarctica, already experiencing a cooling trend through the latest Cretaceous, this impact winter imposed acute thermal stress on populations whose cold tolerance had already been pushed toward its limits by the gradual background cooling of the preceding millions of years. The combination of impact-induced cooling layered on top of the existing trend produced conditions that exceeded the physiological tolerance of organisms that might otherwise have survived either stress in isolation. The collapse of primary productivity propagated through the food web in sequence. Photosynthetic shutdown eliminated the bulk of the terrestrial food web within weeks. Herbivores dependent on living plant material faced immediate starvation. Large-bodied herbivores, with high absolute energy requirements and limited capacity to reduce metabolic rate rapidly, were among the most immediately vulnerable. Smaller herbivores capable of subsisting on stored seeds, fungi, or decaying organic matter persisted longer. But the duration of the productivity collapse, extending across months to years as atmospheric particulates cleared slowly, exceeded the survival window of most large-bodied terrestrial animals, regardless of their dietary flexibility. Predators followed herbivores into population collapse, with a lag determined by their ability to consume existing carcasses and reduce their own activity levels. Large theropods, already operating at reduced population density in the cooling, late Cretaceous Antarctic environment, had insufficient prey biomass to sustain their numbers through an extended productivity collapse. The same endothermic physiology that had allowed them to remain active through polar winters now worked against them. High metabolic rates that could not be substantially reduced meant that energy demands continued even as energy availability dropped toward zero. The apex predators of the Antarctic Cretaceous forest disappeared, not through direct impact effects, but through the cascading collapse of the ecological structure that had sustained them. The marine environment registered the extinction event through parallel mechanisms. Phytoplankton collapse following the impact disrupted the base of the marine food web with the same immediacy as the terrestrial productivity shutdown. Zooplankton populations dependent on phytoplankton declined within weeks. The ammonites, already in global decline through the latest Cretaceous, did not survive the additional stress. Their complete disappearance from the fossil record at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is one of the most globally consistent biological signals in the stratigraphic record, documented in Antarctic marine sequences as clearly as anywhere else on the planet. The large marine reptiles, plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, disappear from Antarctic deposits at the same boundary, their populations unable to sustain themselves through the collapse of the marine food web that had supported them. The enantiornithine birds, the toothed, clawed avian lineage that had diversified extensively through the Cretaceous, did not survive the extinction event. Their disappearance from the global record at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is complete. In Antarctica, where their fossil record was already sparse, their absence from post-boundary deposits is consistent with global patterns. The neornithine birds, the lineage giving rise to all modern birds, survived, apparently through a combination of smaller body size, dietary flexibility, and possibly ground nesting behaviors that provided some insulation against the worst effects of the impact winter. Their survival in Antarctic environments during and after the extinction event laid the foundation for the eventual diversification of the Southern Ocean bird fauna that characterizes the modern continent. The small mammals that had occupied the ecological margins of the Cretaceous Antarctic ecosystem survived for the same reasons they had been ecologically marginal: small body size, low absolute energy requirements, dietary flexibility, and the capacity to exploit food resources distributed at fine spatial scales across a degraded landscape. Seeds, fungi, insects in dormancy, and decaying organic matter provided a minimal but functional energy base for animals whose metabolic demands were low enough to be met by these reduced resources. Their survival was not comfortable or abundant. It was narrow, contingent, and dependent on the specific combination of characteristics that the competitive pressure of the Mesozoic had inadvertently built into them. The Antarctic forests did not vanish instantaneously. Some plant material survived through root systems, buried seeds, and spore banks in the soil. Biological archives capable of regenerating vegetation once light levels recovered. Ferns, consistent with their role as ecological pioneers, documented in post-volcanic recovery sequences, were likely among the first plants to re-establish surface coverage after the impact winter cleared. The fern spike, the characteristic increase in fern spore abundance immediately above the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary in pollen records globally, is present in southern hemisphere sequences, indicating that the recovery pattern documented elsewhere extended to the high southern latitudes. But the forest that eventually re-established itself in Antarctica was not the forest that had existed before. The warm, adapted species that had defined the Cretaceous Antarctic canopy did not return to the same dominance. The climate into which the post-extinction vegetation grew was cooler, and the plant community that assembled itself in that cooler world reflected the new thermal reality rather than the conditions of the vanished past. What the extinction event did to Antarctica was not simply remove a set of species. It removed the ecological architecture within which those species had existed. The trophic relationships, the energy pathways, the behavioral interactions, and the evolutionary pressures that had shaped the continent's biology across tens of millions of years. The large herbivores that had maintained forest structure through browsing and trampling were gone. The apex predators that had regulated herbivore populations were gone. The marine reptiles that had structured the nearshore food web were gone. What remained was a simplified, damaged version of a system that had been among the most complex biological environments on the planet. a remnant community of survivors occupied lands whose ecological roles had been catastrophically vacated in a climate that was already moving in a direction incompatible with the world those survivors had inherited, you said. Continue, but max 7,000 characters. The transformation of Antarctica from a forested continent into the ice-covered landmass recognized today was not a single event. It was a threshold crossed after millions of years of incremental change, a point at which the accumulation of cooling, isolation, and altered atmospheric chemistry reached the level where ice, once it began forming, could sustain and expand itself through its own physical properties. The transition from the last Antarctic forests to permanent glaciation spans a geological interval of roughly 30 to 34 million years ago, during the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, a period now recognized as one of the most significant climate transitions in the last 100 million years of Earth history. The mechanisms driving this transition were multiple and reinforcing. Atmospheric CO2 concentrations had been declining through the Paleogene from their Cretaceous highs, reducing the greenhouse forcing that had maintained polar warmth. The progressive opening of the Drake Passage between Antarctica and South America, deepening through the late Eocene, allowed the Antarctic circumpolar current to fully establish itself for the first time. A reorganization of Southern Ocean circulation that dramatically reduced the poleward transport of warm water to Antarctic margins. These two forcings reduced greenhouse warming from above and reduced ocean heat delivery from below, operated simultaneously, pushing Antarctic temperatures toward the threshold at which permanent ice could survive through summer. Ice formation itself introduced a new physical mechanism into the system. Snow and ice reflect a substantially higher proportion of incoming solar radiation than vegetated or bare ground surfaces, a property measured as albedo. Bare soil reflects roughly 10 to 20% of incoming solar energy. Coniferous forest reflects 8 to 15%. Fresh snow reflects between 80 and 90%. As ice and snow began persisting through summer in the highest elevation regions of the Antarctic interior, the surface energy balance of those areas shifted. More solar radiation was reflected away. Less energy was absorbed and converted to heat. The surface cooled further, allowing more snow to survive the following summer, expanding the reflective surface and cooling the area further still. This feedback loop, the ice albedo feedback, is self-reinforcing once initiated, and its establishment on the Antarctic continent marked the point of no return for the ecosystems, still persisting in lower elevation and coastal zones. The glaciation proceeded from the interior outward. The highest elevation regions of East Antarctica, sitting on bedrock now buried under kilometers of ice, accumulated the first persistent ice sheets. From these elevated nucleation points, ice spread laterally under its own weight, a process governed by the rheology of ice under pressure, the slow plastic deformation of crystalline water ice that allows glaciers to flow across topography over decades and centuries. As the ice sheet expanded, it overrode river systems, filled basins, and progressively buried the soil and rock surfaces that had supported vegetation. The forests retreated before the advancing ice margin, compressed into an ever-narrowing band of ice-free coastal terrain, where ocean proximity still moderated temperature sufficiently to prevent permanent snow cover. The rivers that had drained the Antarctic continent for tens of millions of years were among the first landscape elements to be permanently altered. As temperatures dropped below freezing for increasing portions of the year, river discharge became seasonal and then intermittent. The sediment load carried by these rivers, the material that had built floodplains, nourished wetlands, and deposited the sedimentary sequences now containing Antarctica's fossil record, ceased moving, River channels that had carried water continuously through warm Cretaceous and early Paleogene climates went dry, then frozen. The fluvial networks that had structured the distribution of wetland habitats across the continent were erased, replaced first by snow-covered valleys and eventually by ice-filled troughs as the glaciers extended downslope along former drainage corridors. The vegetation sequence during the final glaciation phase is preserved in pollen records from sediment cores spanning the Eocene-Oligocene transition. The record shows a progressive simplification of the Antarctic flora through the late Eocene. Warm-adapted taxa disappearing first, cool-adapted conifers and southern beech persisting longer, followed by an abrupt decline in total pollen abundance at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary itself. Consistent with rapid vegetation loss as ice advanced across previously forested terrain, southern beech, Nothofagus, was among the last tree genera to persist in Antarctic environments, its cold tolerance allowing it to survive in coastal refugia after other forest components had disappeared. Its eventual loss from the Antarctic continent, documented in the pollen record as a final decline in Nothofagus pollen abundance through the early Oligocene, marks the effective end of woody vegetation on the continent. The animals that remained in Antarctica through the Paleogene faced a narrowing survival corridor. Following the end Cretaceous extinction, the vertebrate fauna had reorganized around the survivors. Small mammals, early birds, and whatever cold-tolerant reptiles had persisted. Through the Eocene, as temperatures gradually declined, but forests still covered coastal and lower latitude zones of the continent. These communities persisted in simplified form. The ecological complexity of the Cretaceous was not recovered. The large-bodied herbivores and predators were gone, and the mammals that might eventually have grown into those ecological roles had not yet had sufficient time, in evolutionary terms, to fully occupy them. The fauna was impoverished relative to its Cretaceous predecessor, and it was being compressed spatially as the habitable zone shrank toward the coast. For marine organisms, the full establishment of the Antarctic circumpolar current produced a different kind of transition. The thermal isolation of Antarctic waters drove rapid cooling of the Southern Ocean, eventually producing the cold, nutrient-rich upwelling system that characterizes the modern Antarctic marine environment. This cold water system supported different organisms than the warm Cretaceous seas. The ammonites and marine reptiles, replaced over millions of years by fish, seabirds, and eventually the whales and seals that define the modern Antarctic fauna. The transition was not instantaneous, and the early Oligocene Southern Ocean was biologically impoverished relative to both its warm Cretaceous predecessor and the eventually productive cold water system it was becoming. The ice, once established, was self-perpetuating. The albedo feedback ensured that the energy conditions sustaining the ice sheet were produced in part by the ice sheet itself. The circumpolar current ensured that warm water could not reach Antarctic margins in sufficient volume to melt the coastal ice. The reduced CO2 concentrations ensured that the greenhouse warming needed to reverse glaciation was not available from the atmosphere. The system had crossed a threshold from which return required either a dramatic increase in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations or a fundamental reorganization of ocean circulation, neither of which occurred on timescales relevant to the organisms caught within the transition. The forests were gone, the rivers were frozen, the soil was buried. The continent that had supported complex ecosystems for tens of millions of years had become, within a geological interval, brief by the standards of deep time, the ice-covered desert it remains today. You said, continue, but max 7,000 characters. The ice covering Antarctica today averages 2.1 kilometers in depth across the continent, reaching a maximum of approximately 4.8 kilometers in the deepest basins of East Antarctica. Beneath that ice lies rock, and within that rock, preserved in sedimentary sequences laid down across hundreds of millions of years, is the physical record of everything that existed on and around the continent before the glaciers arrived. Fossils, pollen grains, ancient soils, river sediments, and the chemical signatures of long-vanished ecosystems are held in place beneath the ice, inaccessible to direct excavation across most of the continent's surface, but recoverable in fragments wherever geological processes have brought ancient rock back into contact with the modern surface. The primary windows into Antarctica's buried biological record are the mountain ranges that protrude through the ice sheet. Nunataks and exposed ridgelines where bedrock rises above the glacier surface and erosion has stripped away overlying material to reveal the sedimentary sequences beneath. The Transantarctic Mountains, extending approximately 3,500 kilometers across the continent, represent the most extensive such exposure. Along their flanks and in valleys, cut by ancient rivers later occupied by glaciers, Cretaceous and Paleogene and sedimentary rocks appear at the surface, carrying within them the fossil material that provide most of what is currently known about Antarctica's pre-glacial ecosystems. The Antarctic Peninsula, extending northward toward South America, provides additional exposure of marine and terrestrial Cretaceous sequences in formations accessible from coastal research stations. Fossil recovery from these exposed formations proceeds under conditions that compress the logistical challenges of fieldwork into their most extreme form. Research teams operating in the Transantarctic Mountains work at elevations between 1,500 and 20,500 meters above sea level, in temperatures that can drop below -30 degrees Celsius, with access restricted to the austral summer window of roughly 3 months per year. Equipment must be transported by aircraft to remote field camps, and specimens extracted from rock must be stabilized and packaged for transport under conditions that would challenge preservation in any context. Despite these constraints, systematic paleontological fieldwork in Antarctic exposures has been conducted since the early 20th century, accumulating a specimen collection that, while smaller than comparable collections from more accessible Cretaceous sites, has proven scientifically significant beyond what its size alone would suggest. The sediment core record extends the biological archive far beyond what surface exposures alone provide. Drilling programs operating from research vessels in the Southern Ocean and from ice-based platforms on the Ross Sea shelf have recovered cores penetrating hundreds of meters into seafloor sediment, sampling biological and chemical records spanning tens of millions of years in continuous sequences. The ANDRILL program, Antarctic Geological Drilling, recovered cores from beneath the Ross ice shelf that reached Miocene, Oligocene, and in some sequences Eocene sediments, preserving pollen assemblages, microfossils, and dark geochemical proxy, documenting the progression of Antarctic climate and vegetation through the glaciation transition. These cores have provided some of the most detailed available records of how Antarctic ecosystems responded to the cooling that eventually eliminated them. The 2020 discovery, published from analysis of a core recovered from the Amundsen Sea sector of West Antarctica, represents one of the most significant recent advances in understanding Cretaceous Antarctic environments. Sediment from approximately 90 meters below the modern seafloor, dated to roughly 90 million years ago, contained fossilized root structures, pollen, spores, chemical markers consistent with a temperate rainforest environment existing within 900 kilometers of the South Pole. The preservation quality was sufficient to allow reconstruction of soil structure, rainfall estimates, and vegetation composition, a level of paleoecological detail rarely achievable from Antarctic material. This discovery extended the known range of Cretaceous Antarctic forest coverage significantly, and provided direct physical evidence for forest conditions at latitudes previously considered compatible with dense vegetation, even under elevated greenhouse conditions. Fossil vertebrate material recovered from Antarctic exposures has accumulated to include representatives of multiple major groups, despite the logistical limitations of fieldwork. Plesiosaur specimens from James Ross Island represent some of the most complete marine reptile material recovered from the continent, including elasmosaurid specimens preserving substantial portions of the vertebral column and limb girdles. Dinosaur material, though more fragmentary, includes ankylosaur, ornithopod, and theropod, elements from Antarctic peninsula formations, enough to establish the presence of multiple dinosaur lineages on the continent and to provide morphological data, allowing comparison with related species from South America and other Gondwanan land masses. Fossil plant material, leaves, wood, roots, and reproductive structures has been recovered from multiple Antarctic formations and provides the botanical foundation for reconstructions of Cretaceous and Paleogene Antarctic vegetation. The wood fossils are particularly informative. Permineralized wood, wood in which the original cellular structures has been replaced by mineral material while preserving the anatomical details of the original tissue, retains growth ring patterns that record annual variation in growing conditions across the lifetime of the tree. Antarctic Cretaceous fossil wood consistently shows densely packed growth rings alternating with narrow rings, a pattern interpreted as the signature of the polar light cycle. Broad rings deposited during the productive summer growing season, narrow rings reflecting the reduced growth rate during the approach to and recovery from polar winter darkness. These rings provide a direct, tree-level record of how individual plants experienced the seasonal cycle of their environment, connecting the large-scale paleoclimate reconstructions derived from geochemical proxies to the biological reality experienced by individual organisms. Ongoing technological development is progressively expanding access to Antarctic fossil material without requiring physical excavation of ice-covered terrain. Ice-penetrating radar systems, operated from aircraft and ground vehicles, have mapped the bedrock topography beneath the Antarctic ice sheet at increasing resolution, revealing the locations of ancient river valleys, lake basins, and sedimentary sequences buried under kilometers of ice. These maps identify potential targets for future deep drilling programs that could recover core material from Cretaceous and Paleogene sediments currently inaccessible from surface exposures. Satellite-based remote sensing has identified additional nunatak exposures and geological features in previously unsurveyed regions that may contain fossil-bearing sequences not yet sampled by ground-based fieldwork. The fossils already recovered and the sediment records already analyzed have established the fundamental outlines of Antarctic biological history with sufficient clarity to support the reconstructions that paleoclimate and paleontological research now builds upon. What remains beneath the ice is not a complete unknown. It is a quantitatively larger version of what is already partially known. More species, more ecological detail, more temporal resolution, waiting in rock that the ice has covered, and the instruments are beginning, slowly, to see through. The biological history of Antarctica is not lost. It is buried, preserved by the same cold that ended it, available to recovery at whatever rate the physics of the ice and the logistics of the most remote continent on Earth allow. You said, continue, but max 7,000 characters. The biological and geological history of Antarctica does not exist in isolation from the broader history of the planet. It is embedded within it, connected through atmospheric chemistry, ocean circulation, tectonic processes, and evolutionary lineages that link the frozen continent to every other part of the Earth system. What the Antarctic record reveals, when read carefully against the backdrop of global paleoclimate and evolutionary history, is not simply the story of one continent's transformation. It is a set of principles about how Earth systems operate, how ecosystems respond to forcing, and how the conditions that support complex life can be assembled, sustained, and dismantled through processes that operate across timescales ranging from years to hundreds of millions of years. The most direct message in the Antarctic record concerns the relationship between atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations and global temperature distribution. The mid-Cretaceous Antarctic forest existed because CO2 concentrations were 2 to 4 times their pre-industrial levels, and that elevated greenhouse forcing was sufficient to extend warmth to within 900 kilometers of the South Pole. The forests disappeared as those concentrations declined. The circumpolar current established itself, and the thermal envelope supporting polar vegetation contracted irreversibly. The causal relationship between atmospheric chemistry and the habitability of high-latitude environments is not inferred indirectly from Antarctic data. It is written into the sediment record as directly as any physical measurement can write it. Warm conditions correlating with high CO2, cooling correlating with its decline, and the biological consequences of each state preserved in the fossils and pollen grains of the rock sequences spanning the transition. The rate of change matters as much as the direction. The cooling that eliminated Antarctic forests proceeded over tens of millions of years, driven by the slow physics of tectonic drift and the gradual decline of atmospheric CO2 through geological carbon cycling. Organisms had time, measured in thousands of generations, to respond through the only mechanisms available to biological systems facing environmental change: migration, adaptation, and, for those unable to do either sufficiently, extinction. The pace of change determined which of these responses was possible. Species could track shifting climate envelopes through migration when the rate of change was slow relative to their dispersal capacity. Evolutionary adaptation could occur when selective pressure was sustained across sufficient generations. Extinction became the outcome when the rate of change exceeded both. This rate dependency has implications that extend directly into the present. The atmospheric CO2 increase documented across the industrial era and its continuation through the present century, proceeding at a rate orders of magnitude faster than the geological processes that drove Cretaceous and Paleogene climate change. The geological record provides no close analogue for the current rate of atmospheric CO2 increase. The closest comparisons come from large igneous province eruptions and the end Cretaceous impact itself, both of which produced biological disruption proportional to their speed. The Antarctic record does not predict specific outcomes for current climate trajectories, but it establishes clearly that the magnitude of warming associated with elevated CO2 concentrations is sufficient to fundamentally restructure high-latitude environment, and that the biological consequences of such restructuring are not reversible on timescales relevant to the organisms experiencing them. The concept of ecological threshold behavior, the tendency of complex systems to maintain apparent stability until a critical forcing level is crossed, after which rapid reorganization occurs, is illustrated in the Antarctic glaciation record with unusual clarity. The transition from forested to glaciated Antarctica at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary was not a gradual, proportional response to gradual cooling. It was a threshold crossing in which the ice albedo feedback converted incremental cooling into rapid, self-sustaining glaciation once ice persistence through summer became physically possible. The system maintained forests through millions of years of slow cooling, absorbing the change through compositional shifts in vegetation and faunal adjustments, and then crossed a threshold beyond which the same incremental cooling produced a qualitatively different outcome. This non-linearity the tendency of Earth systems to respond disproportionately to forcing near critical thresholds, is a recurring feature of the paleoclimate record, and one that simple linear projections of environmental change consistently fail to capture. The evolutionary consequences of isolation, documented in the Antarctic record, illuminate a principle operating across all fragmented ecosystems. When populations are separated from the larger gene pools of which they were previously part, evolutionary trajectories diverge. The rate of divergence depends on population size, generation time, and the intensity of local selective pressure. But the direction is consistent. Isolation produces distinctiveness, and distinctiveness, once established, cannot be reversed by reconnection alone. The Antarctic ecosystems of the late Cretaceous were producing endemic species and distinct evolutionary lineages precisely because tectonic drift was reducing gene flow with South American and Australian populations. The biological uniqueness being generated by that isolation was simultaneously the most interesting evolutionary development occurring on the continent and the most vulnerable outcome of its geography. Unique lineages in a shrinking habitat with no alternative range to retreat into. Extinction, in the Antarctic record, presents itself not as an anomaly, but as the expected outcome of conditions that exceed biological tolerance ranges faster than evolutionary or behavioral adaptation can track. The end Cretaceous extinction reached Antarctica as it reached everywhere through the global atmospheric consequences of a single impact event. But the vulnerability of Antarctic ecosystems at that moment was partly a product of their prior history. Populations already reduced by late Cretaceous cooling, already compressed into smaller geographic ranges, already operating at reduced diversity, had less capacity to absorb additional stress than the same populations would have had at their mid-Cretaceous peak. Extinction risk is not uniform across a system's history. It accumulates with prior stress, and the Antarctic record preserves that accumulation in the progressive simplification of fossil assemblages through the latest Cretaceous. A biological system becoming more fragile before the event that finally broke it. The deep time perspective that Antarctica's geological record provides forces a recalibration of the intuitive sense of environmental permanence that human experience tends to generate. The ice sheet covering Antarctica today is not a geological fixture. It is a feature of the current climate state, assembled under specific atmospheric and oceanographic conditions that have existed for approximately 34 million years. A long time by human standards, but less than 1% of Earth's total age. Before it existed, the continent was green. Before the forests, it was part of a larger landmass whose biological connections extended across the southern hemisphere. Before that, it was closer to the equator, embedded in the supercontinent Gondwana, experiencing climates with no modern analogue. The state of any part of the Earth system at any given moment is not its natural or permanent state. It is a temporary configuration produced by the specific combination of atmospheric, oceanic, tectonic, and biological conditions operating at that time. This impermanence is not pessimistic in its implications. It is descriptive. Earth systems change, have always changed, and will continue changing across timescales that dwarf the intervals of human observation. The Antarctic record documents that change in its most complete available form. A continuous archive from warm forest to frozen desert, preserving in rock and ice the physical evidence of worlds that existed fully, functioned completely, and then ended, leaving behind only the traces that patient geological and biological investigation can recover. The principles embedded in that record, the sensitivity of climate to atmospheric forcing, the threshold behavior of physical feedbacks, the rate dependence of biological responses, the fragility of isolated ecosystems, are not historical curiosities. They are descriptions of how the planet works, derived from the most thorough natural experiment the geological record provides. You said, continue, but Max, 7,000 characters. There is a quality to the modern Antarctic landscape that resists simple description. It is not merely cold, or empty, or remote, though it is all of these in measurable and extreme degrees. It is a place where the physical scale of what is absent exceeds the physical scale of what is present, where the silence is not simply the absence of sound, but the absence of the biological density that would produce sound, where the whiteness is not simply reflected light, but the burial of everything that once absorbed it. Standing unearthed on the Antarctic ice sheet, one is standing on top of a world rather than within one, separated from the rock, the soil, the fossils, and the chemical traces of vanished ecosystems by kilometers of compressed ice that preserve the past while making it completely inaccessible to direct experience. The ice itself is not static. It flows, under its own weight, from the interior plateau toward the coast, at rates between a few centimeters and several meters per day, depending on the underlying topography and the thermal conditions at the ice bed interface. This flow carries material, dust, volcanic ash layers, biological particles, that was incorporated into the ice at the surface decades, centuries, or millennia earlier. Ice cores drilled from the Antarctic plateau have recovered continuous climate records extending back 800,000 years, preserving in the chemistry of each annual ice layer a detailed record of atmospheric composition, temperature, and biological productivity at the time of deposition. The ice is an archive as surely as the rock beneath it, recording a different temporal range and a different category of information, but connected to the same understanding how the planet's systems have operated across deep time. The wind moves across the ice surface in a way that has no equivalent in vegetated landscapes, without trees to break it, without soil to absorb its energy, without any surface roughness beyond the micro-scale features of the ice itself. The wind accelerates across the polar plateau in continuous uninterrupted flows that can sustain speeds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour. In katabatic events, gravity-driven drainage of cold, dense air from the elevated interior toward the coast. These winds carry no biological material. They transport ice crystals, mineral dust from exposed nunatak surfaces, and occasionally sea salt lifted from the coastal margins. They are the dominant geomorphological agent on a continent where liquid water is nearly absent, and where the processes that shape most of the Earth's land surface, rainfall, river erosion, biological weathering, have been suspended for tens of millions of years. Beneath the ice, subglacial lakes persist in liquid form despite the surface conditions. Lake Vostok, the largest of more than 400 identified subglacial lakes, lies beneath approximately 3.7 kilometers of ice in East Antarctica. Its water maintained in liquid state by geothermal heat from the bedrock below and the insulating pressure of the ice above. The water in these lakes has been isolated from the surface for millions of years in some cases, and microbial life has been detected in ice cores from the accretion ice forming at the lake surface. Organisms metabolizing at the extreme lower boundary of biological activity, sustained by chemical energy in the absence of sunlight, in conditions more analogous to the subsurface oceans, hypothesized on icy moons of the outer solar system than to any surface environment on Earth. Even in the most frozen state of a continent, defined by cold, life persists at the margins of what physics allows. The coastline of modern Antarctica presents a different character than the interior. Here, where the ice sheet reaches the ocean and carves into icebergs, where exposed rock at sea level supports colonies of seabirds and the hauling grounds of seals, the continent maintains a biological presence that the interior entirely lacks. Penguins navigate the interface between ice and water with a physical precision that reflects tens of millions of years of evolutionary specialization. The Neornithine bird lineage that survived the end Cretaceous extinction diversifying through the Paleogene and Neogene. Interforms adapted to the cold Southern Ocean that the continent's isolation and glaciation had created. They are not the descendants of the toothed, forest-dwelling birds of the Cretaceous Antarctic canopy in any direct ecological sense. They occupy a different world, shaped by different conditions, and they are adapted to that world with the same fidelity that their distant predecessors were adapted to theirs. The fossils emerging from exposed Antarctic rock surfaces carry within them a different kind of presence than the living organisms of the coastline. A plesiosaur vertebra, recovered from a James Ross Island formation, grey, mineralized, heavy with replaced calcium phosphate, was once part of an animal moving through warm water above a continental shelf that no longer exists in any recognizable form. The bone records, in its microstructure, the growth history of that individual, the annual increments of tissue deposition, the remodeling events that overprinted earlier growth, the final cessation of growth that marks the animal's death. Between the moment that bone was deposited and the moment it was recovered by a researcher on a summer field expedition, approximately 75 million years elapsed. The rock surrounding it accumulated, lithified, was buried, was uplifted, was eroded by glaciers, and was finally exposed at a surface where human observation became possible. The bone persisted through all of it. The pollen grains recovered from Antarctic sediment cores are smaller than the fossils and individually invisible without magnification. But they carry equivalent temporal weight. A single Nothofagus pollen grain extracted from an Eocene sediment layer and examined under a scanning electron microscope preserves, in its sculptured outer wall, the precise morphological characteristics of the plant that produced it. Characteristics refined over millions of years of evolution, expressed in a structure measuring tens of micrometers across, surviving in recognizable form for tens of millions of years after the plant itself, the forest it grew within, and the entire ecological community that forest supported have vanished completely from the surface of the earth. The specificity of what survives and the totality of what does not defines the character of the fossil record as a source of knowledge about deep time. The modern Antarctic interior offers, in its silence and scale, an inadvertent index of what was lost, where river sediments once accumulated in floodplains supporting wetland communities of amphibians and invertebrates. The ice flows slowly toward the coast, carrying nothing biological, where forest soil once supported root networks extending meters into organic-rich substrate. Bedrock sits under kilometers of glacial compression, its surface scoured clean of any biological material, where the calls of animals moving through summer forest once constituted the acoustic environment of a functioning ecosystem. The wind moves across featureless ice without interruption, carrying no biological information in any direction. This is not a landscape that mourns its own history. It has no capacity for that. It is a physical system operating according to the laws governing ice, rock, wind, and cold, indifferent to the complexity that preceded it, and to the observation being directed at it from research stations whose combined permanent population represents a smaller number of individuals than a single colonial seabird nesting site on the coast. The history is in the rock, the present is in the ice, and somewhere in the space between what the sediment records and what the modern surface shows, the full scope of what Antarctica once was: warm, forested, biologically dense, ecologically complex, connected to the living world, remains available to reconstruction, one fossil, one pollen grain, one isotope ratio at a time, for as long as the ice continues to yield what it has covered, and the science continues to ask what lies beneath.